Welcome to Mansfield College. My name's Helen Mountfield. I'm the principal here, and it's a great honour to me to welcome you to joining us this evening at our annual Jonathan Cooper Memorial Lecture. This is always a bittersweet evening. It's sweet because we have a fantastic talk by an interesting speaker, but it's always very sad that Johnny himself isn't here. For those who didn't know him, Jonathan Cooper, Johnny, was an extraordinary human rights advocate in the broadest sense, and one of the UK's, in fact probably the world's most influential advocates for human rights and LGBTQ plus rights. His work helped shape the legal profession, legal protections, public understanding, and crucially the lived experience of many people whose voices had too often gone unheard. And I think Johnny's first degree in history, and his interest in history and whose voices get heard and why, really shone through in the way that he lived his professional and personal lives. He combined intellectual precision and a wicked laugh with deep humanity, and he could construct a compelling legal argument and never lose sight of the person at the centre of it. And also, for many of us here, he was a brilliant friend. I'm lucky to count myself among them, and to Helen and Diana, who is a dear little brother, and to Kitty, who is an uncle. Johnny brought warmth, wit, and a certain irreverence to even the most serious conversations, alongside his unwavering commitment to justice. And tonight is at its heart an act of remembrance, but it is also a continuation. Johnny loved to explore ideas. He didn't believe in standing still. He believed in progress. He believed in pushing for change and in the responsibility for making both of those things happen. And this lecture series is one way in which that spirit lives on, and we are very grateful to the Sigrid Rausing Trust for supporting it. Sigrid, I think I might need a seat, was also a great friend of Johnny's, and that friendship was reflected and is reflected in the character of this evening, thoughtful, engaged, and quietly determined to make a difference. So thank you very much, Sigrid, for making this lecture possible. I'd also like to acknowledge the Jonathan Cooper Chair in the History of Sexualities at Mansfield College and at the University of Oxford, which is endowed by the Arcadia Foundation, Lisbeth Rausing and Peter Baldwin's Foundation. That post was a dream which Johnny and his husband Kevin and I were talking about during the pandemic, and which sadly came to be named for him, something he would have found both touching and extremely amusing through the sad circumstances of his sudden death. But that chair is a lasting academic testament to the field that Johnny helped illuminate, and is held by my wonderful colleague, Professor Matt Cook, who is also the introduction to tonight's speaker. And I think tonight is above all about people and the ideas and the commitments that connect us and the connections that we make as people and how we learn from them. So it is a great pleasure for me this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor Joanna Bourke. Joanna is one of the most distinguished historians working today, with a scholarship that explores how societies understand bodies, emotions, violence, and power, all subjects that Jonathan found endlessly fascinating and important. And her work asks difficult questions about how we can know how other people think and feel and imagine, and whose experiences are recognised and whose are not. Like Johnny, she brings enormous energy to her work. She's published more than 15 books, 120 articles, and she's been a Gresham lecturer. And she brings huge intellectual rigour, but also a willingness to engage with complexity, unexplored perspectives on issues, and to challenge us to think more compassionately and carefully about the world we inhabit. So it's a wonderful thing that she is here this evening to give this lecture in Johnny's memory tonight. And as we listen this evening, I hope we might hold two things in mind. First, the memory of Johnny himself, and his friendship and his energy and his clarity of purpose. And also the need to understand different people's perspectives and the ongoing work to which he dedicated his life, because that work is so far from finished, and in different ways it calls on all of us. So thank you all for being here, for supporting this lecture, and for helping to carry forward a legacy that matters very deeply today. Please can you join me in welcoming Professor Joanna Bourke.
Wow, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, and especially for the people who helped organise this and invited me. I'm really, really thrilled to be able to speak today about some of the new work that I'm doing and thinking about. Now, a confession, I actually never met Jonathan Cooper, but actually it turns out that we shared a lot of really good friends who always praised his enthusiasm, kindness, sense of humour, enjoyment of nature, and gifts for both friendship and love. Now, I say these things before mentioning his remarkable career as a legal and human rights campaigner, because it was actually Jonathan's emotional, sensual, and empathetic life that made him so fierce and effective in his legal work and activism. I was thinking of him when I wrote this talk. To survive, let the past teach you. So wrote Octavia Butler in The Parable of the Talents, an Afro-futurist novel set in 2032. Now, when she published the novel, 1998, it was a time when she feared that America was kind of sleepwalking into fascism. She had not intended the book to be prophetic. Writing novels about the future doesn't give me any special ability to foretell the future, she acknowledged, adding, however, that speculative fiction does encourage me to use our past and present behaviours as a guide to the kind of world we seem to be creating. Now, for Butler in the 1990s, that world was one marked, or marred, if you like, by racist violence, the colossal funding of the carceral state, the prison state, and the defunding of social welfare provisions with equally harmful effects. It was a world dominated, as she put it, by the forces of late-stage capitalism, climate change, mass incarceration, big pharma, gun violence, and the tech industry run amok. Both Republican and Democratic presidents, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, were loudly pledging, of course, to make America great again, a slogan repurposed notoriously by Trump. But as Butler explained in 1998, all I did was look around at the problems we're neglecting now and give them about 30 years to grow into fully fledged disasters. 30 years from 1998? Well, unfortunately, that is our present. Now, in recent years, I found myself reflecting on my career spent just trying to understand the overblown, breathless, carnivalesque even, languages associated with violence, more the unmaking than the making of life. Now, I'm not going to be exploring international conflicts today, it's not my field, but I cannot help but be affected by what is happening in the world as I was writing this talk: Gaza, Ukraine, Iran, Lebanon, to name just a few. It's not possible to stand outside the spectacle of toxic, militaristic nationalism in which large numbers of people are insisting that their racialized and gendered entitlements are being taken by immigrants, feminists, leftists. The rhetoric of human rights that Jonathan Cooper advanced is being used to champion white male supremacy. Gender differences are once again being vilified, including this kind of obscene obsession with trans people. Girl power has become a vehicle for a scorched earth policy on female bodily integrity or autonomy. And people, they just kind of wax lyrical about the sanctity of life of a pre-embryonic blastocyst while bombarding entire cities. Like many, perhaps I think in this room, creative fictions have prompted me to think more about the world in which we live. Novels, poems, art have this kind of uncanny ability to unmake what we think we know, denaturalizing humdrum practices and principles, stretching and then contracting time, providing space to imagine a new making, a not yet. So it was, I think, with a sense of excitement that I picked up Butler's Parable of the Talents. It's a story of Lauren Olamina, a hyper-empathetic woman of color who creates an alternative, interracial, egalitarian community called Acorn. Rather than promising to make white America great again, Lauren seeks to embrace in diversity, dismantling hierarchies based on racialization, gender, class, ableism, sexuality, and so on. Violence in the novel, though, could not be avoided. Andrew Steele Jarrett, he wins the American presidency by taking advantage of the very same fears that he himself created. He demonizes immigrants, effectively employs the slogan, "Make America Great Again." As a totalitarian populist and white strongman for fundamentalist Christianity, Jarrett plans to return America to a theocratic dictatorship, resurrecting its glorious past by re-educating, beautiful euphemism for torture, Americans who have gone astray. Jarrett, quote, wants to take us back to some magical time when everyone believed in the same God. But there was never such a time in this country. But these days, when more than half the people can't read at all, history is just one great unknown to them. Clad in belted black tunics with big white crosses on their chests, Jarrett's paramilitary crusaders, it's going to come up later in this talk, attack Acorn, torturing, raping, enslaving members, as well as kidnapping the children of Acorn to be fostered by true evangelical Christians. One of these children is Lauren's daughter, Larkin, who, despite the fact that the people who adopt her are sexually as well as psychologically abusive, prefers the security of the Christian nation to the chaos of the street. Now, The Parable of the Talent, I think, is a really good novel to think with in today's times. My themes in this talk are going to start with talking, and I hope you're going to see how they all come together at the end. Start with the long war and culture wars and the way they resonated with wound nationalism and Republican Christian evangelicalism. Then changing rhetorics associated with the old tropes of family values, new coalitions between evangelicals and Republican groups and gender-critical feminists, and their co-option of human rights discourse and anti-colonial discourses. And finally, the contrast between the politics of resilience and the politics of resistance. So my starting point, which I'm going to whiz through more quickly because it's more familiar to people here, my starting point is the long war or the war without end. Concepts really common not only in Afro-futurist critiques like Butler's, but also in Republican and Christian nationalist circles today. As concepts focusing on cultural phenomenon, the long war can be traced to the 1990s with the event of a right-wing rhetoric insisting that America's been plunged into culture wars. The basic idea of the culture war and its chief spokesmen were well known to Butler as she was writing her novel. They are, of course, men like the paleoconservative and two-time presidential candidate Pat Buchanan, who infamously, during the 1992 presidential Republican National Convention, infamously informed the Assembly that there is a religious war going on in our country for the soul of America. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we will one day be as the Cold War was. However, this concept of the long war saw, of course, a massive explosion post 9/11 when numerous political and military commentators, including General George W. Casey, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, declared that, and this is a phrase that comes up just literally hundreds of times, we are operating in an era of persistent conflict, a time when Americans need to become better prepared warriors for the long war. Now, as these very familiar quotations suggest, one of the most formidable weapons in the arsenal wielded by cultural warriors is the militarization of critique, which, as you'll probably notice, even this sentence itself performs by referencing weapons, arsenals, warriors. Anti-militarists have long cautioned against using war metaphors outside of armed conflicts, warning that such metaphors threaten or they deflate the lethal horrors of actual hostilities. We can look around the world and know what we're talking about. Perhaps, though, more relevant in our context today is the way that interpreting cultural and ideological differences as part of a war further cements rigid animosities, contributing itself to processes of enmification and lining up a host of differences into two warring sides. One, a righteous crusade, the other, godless revolt. It contributes to a particular ethno-nationalist framing of the world as a dangerous place, dominated by devious and probably perverted intellectuals, experts, and mainstream, as well as left-leaning politicians. Now, in the past, I've suggested that the term culture wars pretends that culture lies outside of politics and ideology, but that no longer holds. In recent decades, what used to be an invisible component of culture, that is political whiteness, has become, in fact, hyper-visible. Today, almost 70% of Republicans and more than half of Democrats believe that changing demographics, beautiful Butlerian euphemism, poses a threat to white Americans and their cultures and values. Over 3/5 of white evangelical Protestants and 2/3 of all Republicans believe that discrimination against white Americans is as big a problem as discrimination against racialized minorities. Today, half believe in the Great White Replacement Theory or white genocide, and half of Republicans, but over 1/5 of Democrats and independents also believe this. So I've published and written on these things in different contexts, specifically the ways in which this long culture wars contributed to the rise of what I've called wound nationalism. Wound nationalism thrives in cultures preoccupied with a sense of material, psychological, and moral injuries. Now, don't get me wrong, there are material realities to the grievances, but the wound lies not in the material. Rather, wound nationalism is about a profound sense of aggrieved entitlement, or this idea that the very American soul is being actively and purposefully attacked by the usual suspects: multiculturalists, immigrants, Muslims, LGBTQ plus people, abortionists, feminists, snowflakes, along with champions of gender ideology, affirmative action, and university courses in the arts and humanities. By the way, it's really distressing to know that three-fifths of Republicans and one-fifth of Democrats believe that higher education is extremely detrimental to society. That's just a little statistic I wanted to throw out there. It's very distressing. It's a cheery talk. Okay. The densely entangled intersectionality of those enemies that I just mentioned. You know, they could be simultaneously a feminist, gender diverse immigrant reading history in Oxford. The densely entangled intersectionality has resulted in certain groups of course, taking the brunt of the onslaught. As critical race theorist and the Seal Whittley put it, one of the dangers of standing in the intersection is the likelihood of being run over. I wish I had written that. I just wish I had written that. Okay. Representatives of a Christian God, of course, are driving some of those vehicles of destruction, using tropes that have become familiar today. The authoritarian President Jarrett, in Butler's Parable of the Talents, tells his followers that America was God's country and God took care of his own. These pagans are lovers of Satan, seducers of our children, rapists of our women, drug sellers, usurers, thieves, and murderers. Now, Jarrett's sermon conjures up not only the culture wars of the 1990s, when Butler, of course, was writing this, but also, of course, the conspiracies of our time. QAnon with its deep state, satanic worship, manospheric fury, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and so-called rampant pedophilia, Pizzagate, etc. It also draws attention, I think, to shifts within evangelical Christianity and their strategies for increasing power and influence, while, of course, assuring that God's blessing continues to be given to the faithful. Attempts to secure national transformation through spiritual warfare against the evil one. Here I'm thinking about Billy Graham's type crusades with Jesus as our great commander in the long war. That kind of approach began declining from the 1980s, when it was feared that, in fact, these kind of revivalist endeavors had failed to bring Americans back to biblical principles. Encouraged by Reagan's political campaigns and then presidency, evangelicals increasingly turned to state and to federal party politics to achieve their social as well as spiritual ends. A central plank in the shift was a scriptural reading of history in which the long war is very long indeed. Stretches back in time to biblical revelation. Under its authority, evangelical Christians had we're told that not only that rejection by this world is written in the scriptures, but their persecution, their being wounded, if you like, was a testament to their true faith. As evangelical preachers constantly remind their flock, Jesus informed his disciples that if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. John 15:18-20. Claims of being rejected by this world are central to social memory within these religious organizations, forming extremely rich theological, communal, and historical narratives for understanding loss and reasserting social belonging around which evangelical communities cohere. Now, there's one really distinctive component that distinguishes the wound nationalism of evangelicals from their secular counterparts. In other words, it's not only the humiliations and insults of the past and the present that trouble them. Rather, the future, place, causality, and sequence, causality, sequence of their tribulations are already known. So what I'm trying to say here is that for these evangelicals, the future is always already present, as foretold in Scripture. Now, there are two important theological structures within these groups. In fact, there's more than two, but I'm only going to mention two because they're the most dominant ones. And these are postmillennialism and premillennialist dispensationalism. So postmillennialists, representative of this would be Pete Hegseth, with the tattoo on his shoulder arm. Battle cry from the anti-Muslim crusades of the 11th century. People like this believe that the job of Christians is to build the kingdom of God on earth first, before Jesus returns to finally defeat Satan and establish the kingdom of God on earth. In contrast, premillennialist dispensationalists, examples sort of Mike Huckabee and Paula White-Cain, spiritual advisor to Trump, they contend that God has made 7 dispensations, or schemes according to which he carries out his purpose towards humanity. In the current and final dispensation, which is what we're living in now, the Jews will return to Palestine, true Christians will be miraculously taken up to heaven, the rapture, after which the Antichrist will reign for 7 years, followed by devastating wars, tribulation, which will culminate in the Battle of Armageddon. Only then will Satan be defeated and Jesus return to establish his global theocracy. 9/11 strengthened these beliefs. 1 in every 4 Americans believe that 9/11 was prophesied in the Bible. And none have been able to tell me exactly where. And nearly 60% of Americans, this is all Americans, not religious ones, 60% of Americans believe it is proof that the events predicted in Revelations are about to come true. Although, of course, because God's time is not ours, decades may pass, as indeed they have. Although this is predominantly a trend within evangelical circles, 67% of evangelical Protestants and 70% of black Protestants believe that they are living in end times. It also includes half of all Christians in non-evangelical ministries and 40% of Americans of any denomination or no denomination. Okay. Such beliefs, I think, help make sense of why they are blasé about violence, whether we're talking about environmental, climate devastation, or whether we're talking about militarists, wars in the Middle East. After all, violence has been ordained by God as heralding in the end times, and 2, for many dispensationalists, human action can actually bring forward the rapture. This helps explain why Christian nationalists actively support militarist interventions and wars in the Middle East. For example, 2003, 87% of white evangelicals supported the invasion of Iraq, compared to 59% of Americans overall. And of course, Iran has a special place in this story, in end times thinking, since Ezekiel 38:39 is interpreted to mean that the worldwide catastrophe will be sparked by Iran attacking Israel in that interpretation. Now, for anyone raised in an evangelical Christian home, as I was, so this is all very personal actually to me, and familiar with the acceleration of end-time talk following 9/11, which incidentally was greatly exacerbated by COVID-19, the lockdowns of COVID-19, which drove evangelicals globally into the much more cynical embrace of American televangelists. But for us, this acceleration, the radicalization of evangelicalism is as much about domestic as it is about international politics. God's retributive prerogatives go well beyond end-time thinking. The war is long and without end, at least until the rapture for true believers and Armageddon for the rest of us, or the tribulation for the rest of us, and it's all-encompassing. Every aspect of life, every minutiae of living is folded in to God's plan. Nothing is random, nothing accidental. There can be no bystanders. There are only those for and those against God. This is why evangelicals have moved increasingly towards the position that they need to engage, they need to intervene in government to force through policies reflecting God's values. And of course, well, we all know this, Trump is their man. Both in 2016 and 2024, 81% of white evangelical Christians voted for him. Now, they candidly turned to scriptures to admit that, of course, Trump is flawed. Even imperfect vessels can be used by God to fulfill his end, Romans 13:1, and a host of other scriptures. And then there is Trump's support of Israel, which, by the way, could actually be his downfall if powerful commentators like Tucker Carlson have their way. His packing of the Supreme Court with socially conservative anti-abortion judges, his rhetoric about white heterosexuality, his anti-immigration stance, his disdain for separatist powers and international institutions, and so on and so on. And I don't think we should neglect the performative aspects as well. Trump's me against the world persona mirrors their own sense of being besieged by malign forces in the world. And political theorist Wendy Brown, I think, expresses this concisely in the Nietzschean concept of ressentiment, or white grievance politics. It not only leads to a permanent politics of revenge, but also to an attraction to leaders who dismiss conventional norms of polite speech, diplomacy, and civic respect. And there is something thrillingly defiant about Trump's blustering sprezzatura, or to paraphrase the musician Leonard Cohen, his performance as the drunk in the presidential choir. Important, though, amongst these values is, of course, a heterosexual hierarchical model of the family and fetal protectionism. It's funny, isn't it? I love it. Unfortunately, it was from an incel website. Known, of course, in religious circumstances as fetal salvation. Now, I don't want to imply that these so-called family values were what catapulted evangelicals into direct engagement in state and federal politics. Other historians, I think, have made really convincing arguments that there's financial incentives that really were the driving force, specifically political attempts to strip non-tax status from discriminatory religious schools like Bob Jones University. They say that, they were provoked actually by the threat of crippling losses, economic losses, to evangelical institutions. However, questions of sexuality and reproduction certainly roused the flock, because those who are for God will be blessed and rendered strong. LGBTQ plus rights and gender ideology have, of course, become a direct threat to American flourishing. And white women have played major roles in these campaigns, which is not at all surprising, since white women have voted for the Republican Party in every single, vastly majority, in every single election except 2 since the 1950s. Despite the fact that attacks on welfare systems, restrictions on bodily autonomy, the delegitimization of public services, the positioning of public employees as part of a woke elite, and the rewarding of personal loyalty over competence are all more harmful to women than men. But despite this, White women are ideologically aligned with right-wing populism because it serves their interest in preserving both white privilege and heteronormativity. And there's some really interesting work that actually disaggregates that white women that I'm talking about, and it actually shows that the white women who are voting for Trump are married women. They are not. They're white married, heterosexual married women. They are not single, divorced, separated or widowed, let alone LGBTQ plus ones. Now, for these white married middle class women, pronatalist policies and sex inequality were either welcomed by tradwives, great book has been written about them recently, or was seen as these kind of minor irritants that would gradually seep away in a post-feminist, post-liberal world. Such policies would reassert their status as biological reproducers of the nation, bearers, if you like, of the collective. They were nostalgic for a past where they could stay at home, performing the prestigious labor of intensive childcare, driving kids to extracurricular activities, indulging in luxury consumerism, and staging imitations of MasterChef in their kitchen, which, by the way, I think is a really good thing, while leaving the undervalued, most tiresome aspects of housework to be carried out by women of colour, most of whom were immigrants. Perhaps more dismaying is the way these domestic policies, which have been exported globally, there's a global story here I'm just ignoring right now, have driven coalitions between four previously antagonistic groups, including between so-called gender-critical or non-inclusive feminists and right-wing evangelical and Republican organizations such as Hands Across the Aisle Coalition, Heritage Foundation, Alliance Defending Freedom, Concerned Parents and Educators, and so on and so on, who of course all have long histories of attempting to limit women's reproductive rights, prohibit gay marriage and parenting, criminalize Black Lives Matter, and prevent the teaching of critical race theory and gender studies. The unifying banner. So what's unifying these groups? The unifying banner has been genderism, blamed for all, a very frightening word, blamed for all that is frightening in the world, such as the social construction of gender. Genderism has even been used as a scapegoat for the paedophile scandals that have enveloped Catholic and Protestant, especially evangelical, churches. And the vectors of evil are inclusive feminist movements and international organizations, EU, UN, WHO, who are believed to be adopting an interpretation of human rights that not only protects, but privileges minorities while dismantling the securities of white majorities. And coalitions between anti-genderists and conservatives have in fact been remarkably effective in mobilizing languages of anti-colonialism and human rights. They claim that LGBTQ+ rights are liberal and Western impositions on the global South. Egalitarian itself is presented as a form of Western colonialism, fundamentally foreign to former colonial peoples. As Elisabetta Korochuk and Agnieszka Graf put it, wonderful, wonderful work they've done, anti-genderists have created a new language of anti-capitalist mobilization, albeit an anti-liberal populist one. The co-option of language drawn from human rights is equally important, I think, in this story. Take the example, I'm just going to give you one example here, of Hands Across the Aisle Coalition, American organization founded 2017, explicitly to create or to enable, if you like, links between non-inclusive, gender-critical feminists and conservative organizations, such as the Heritage Foundation. They state that, Hands Across the Aisle state that, for the first time, women from across the political spectrum have come together to challenge the notion that gender is the same as sex. We are radical feminists, lesbians, Christians, conservatives, that are tabling our ideological differences to stand in solidarity against gender identity legislation, which we have come to recognize as the erasure of our own hard-won civil rights. An extraordinary statement which adopts leftist language, solidarity, human rights, transversalism. It's using these languages. More than a decade ago, sociologist Sarah Farris coined, I think, a really important word for these movements, and that is femo-nationalism, or the appropriation of feminist and human rights discourses by conservative nationalist groups to promote racist, xenophobic, and aporophobic policies. And coalitions between these groups have gained increasing influence within international organizations. Subtle changes of language, which I can talk about later. Subtle changes of language are really important, such as changing equality regardless of gender for equal dignity for men and women. Claims of a genocide of innocent babies, abortion, persists, but then has been a marked rise in the language of protecting female victims from the exploitative and profiteering abortion industry. And a similar trend can be seen in the anti-trans lobby, which, as Claire Thorlon argues, deliberately adopted the term gender critical as a rebranding to garner mainstream support. In her words, it involved a linguistic pivot from anti-trans to pro-woman. And on a wider scale, despite the UN's commitment to all human beings being born free and equal in dignity and rights, a central strategy has been to give precedence to Articles 16.1 and 16.5, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which protects the right to marry and to found a family, and states that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection. These articles were used by activists like Jonathan Cooper to argue for same-sex marriage and rights, yet they're being used perversely to advance the ends of the heterosexual family. In countering such ideological grabs, we need to resist, I think, the post-9/11 politics of resilience, which is prominent in the explosive growth of self-help literatures, as much as in politics today. It's also a mantra used far too frequently amongst democratic leaders during the current administration. Robin May Schultz and I argue in our 2022 book, Resilience, Militarism, Militarisation, that this concept of resilience, made powerful by its adoption within the military, all branches of the military, quickly made its way into the social imaginary as a framing metaphor used to make sense of people's social existence and norms as much as their inner lives. Its appeal drew on specific historical contexts that include a religious tradition that emphasizes the positive power of the mind, most notably in the power of prayer. But historically, there are secular equivalents as well, including the mental hygiene movement of the early 20th century and the mid-20th century, positive thinking. The popularity, though, of resilience grew immeasurably after 9/11. And this represents a powerful shift in the way bad events were narrated. Now, there's a long history of how you make sense of bad events. I'm not going to talk about it here, but you get Soldier's Heart, nostalgia during the American Civil War, you get railway spine, 1860s, you get shell shock, First World War, you get war exhaustion, World War II, published a lot about these things. But just to illustrate what I think is the magnitude of this shift, I want to start not there, but in 1980, when PTSD entered the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, the Bible of the American Psychiatric Association, and its chief diagnostic manual with global reach. Crucially, and unlike previous conceptualizations, which were based on industrialization and war, the DSM actually named two gender paradigmatic traumas: war for men, rape for women. That's the only two they name. In addition, while previous conceptualizations had this sort of undercurrent of malingering, scrimshanking, etc., the diagnosis of PTSD actually allowed for a degree of societal responsibility. For disturbed servicemen, pensions. For rape survivors, carceralism. Lock them up, lock up the perps, throw away the key. This changed in the 21st century. Trauma replaced by resilience, bad events normalized within neoliberal and neoconservative economies. This was exactly what Octavia Butler foresaw in Parable of the Talents, when her daughter is portrayed as becoming consumed with the virtual reality of dream masks, which allow her to escape the pain caused by her family and a dictatorial theocracy. Her resilience to the oppressive world was in contrast to her mother's resistance to trauma. The shift from PTSD to resilience assumes that vulnerability and suffering are actually intrinsic to the long war. Resilience rhetoric imagines trauma to be internal to the system, especially the distress caused by foreseeable bad events, notably job precarity, status anxiety, and widening inequality. Concept of resilience brushes aside the intertwining of power and structural inequality. The dominant message is post-traumatic growth. Bad things just happen to make you go stronger. They are inducement to resilience. In the words of common memes, you can't get a pearl without grit, bend like a tree in the wind, metals become purer through the application of intense heat. There is no space left for political, ideological, or institutional critique and resistance. Now I'm going to make a statement. I don't intend this talk to be depressing. As Octavia Butler contended, there may be nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. My talk has been about power and entitlement and ideology, but it's also about the mobilization of a religious rhetoric that has deep roots in American society, even amongst non-believers. One critic, who I admire actually very strongly, argues that people experience structural social injuries as traumas when they do not possess adequate analyses of the processes or formations that have harmed them. Well, I just think that misses the point entirely. As I mentioned earlier, there are extremely rich theological, communal, historical narratives that interpret loss and reassert social belonging. Many of these languages stem from interpretations. I've written down here bastardized, but maybe I'll wimp that down. Interpretations of Christian texts in the long war against the forces of evil, both in this world and in the world to come. Eternal lives are at stake. The imperfect vessel, the strategic Christian, Donald Trump, will be exchanged for another, but the outcome must be the same. Now, some of the bulwarks that we expected to hold have not. International law has so far proved impotent. As Trump put it, he who saves his country does not violate any law. Domestic legislation has been disappointing. It turns out to be remarkably easy to pack the Supreme Court. The post-1990s dependency on the carceral system, abandoning principles of rehabilitative and restorative, let alone transformative justice, have proven highly discriminatory and cruel, as they were intended to be. Nevertheless, As Jonathan Cooper recognized, we must not minimize the power of bottom-up activism and coalitions of critical networks. And I talk about these things in greater detail in both of these two books, but particularly in the Disgrace book. I'm an optimist. On a personal note, I take inspiration from art, poetry, fiction, and other creative endeavors. Parable of the Talents presents two different responses to fear: Christian American authoritarianism, prejudice, and submission, versus Acorn's egalitarian political community of people who resist and indeed fight. In Octavia Butler's book, America is in a state of historical amnesia with its contempt of difference. It's a world she imagined would exist 30 years after she wrote it, Our Times, a world where, in her words, history is just one more vast unknown. This is one of the reasons why historians and other scholars in the social sciences, humanities, law, and arts are so important as actors in public spheres, as debunkers of populist historical narratives and distorted readings of scriptures. Don't get me wrong here, I am not starry-eyed about the power of historical arguments, legal decisions, or the creative energies of the arts and humanities, let alone the uncanny ability of Afro-futurist novels to unmake and then provide a space to imagine a new making. After all, Butler's Parable of the Talents ends with the community leaving the earth to found another community, a utopian one. But there is an ominous element. The spaceship is named Christopher Columbus. History may have been forgotten after all. As Jonathan knew only too well, human rights are at risk. Jonathan looked forward to the day when government and all public authorities agree to be accountable for conduct that may interfere with these fundamental human rights principles. He understood that we can choose a different future based on our ability, as he wrote, to use our past and present behaviors as a guide. I started this talk with Butler's exhortation, if you like, to, as she put it, to survive, let the past teach you. But the poem actually ends differently. It ends with, to survive, know the past, let it touch you, and then just let the past go. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna, for that marvellous lecture. I think Johnny would have been puzzled, and I'm puzzled, by why these very negative, closed narratives, the ones that are gaining prominence now. Do you have an idea about that, or a theory for why that might be?
Yeah, firstly, the closed narratives are not as closed as we sometimes think when we're watching the news or scrolling on our social media, that there are really vibrant ground resistance that is taking place, and actually positive and optimistic resistances that are taking place at ground level. And I do think that whenever I think about these sorts of topics, I do want us to always emphasize that. But you're absolutely right. The negative is so dominant in the current situation. And from all sides, from the left, from the right, from the center, we all have this different narrative that we are telling. Certainly from the people that I'm talking about and focusing on most in this paper, I think it is this sense of entitlements that you thought you were entitled to, that seem to be there forever. Of course, that's where history needs to come into it again, because of course they weren't there forever. But things that people thought would be the same, and that they would have these privileges, that they see, rightly or wrongly, and there is some truth in what they are seeing, to be seeping away. And this is why that wound that comes up in really angry ways in so much of the political commentary from the right, but also a little bit from the left, is so potent and so powerful. Because it's telling a story that helps explain why we're not getting what we thought we were entitled to.
Thank you. We've got a huge audience, not much time, and I'm sure a lot of questions, so I'm now going to just invite you to ask any questions you may want, and if you put your hand up, we'll bring a microphone so other people can hear the question. Where are we going to start? There, in the back. Yes.
Thank you very much. I thought that was very interesting. But I do wonder a little bit about using just so many American examples and generalizing from that into a kind of global sense of doom and dismay. And I wonder if you look at the British situation or particularly European situations, do you really believe that this feverish American moment is as universal as it seems to be in your talk?
Absolutely not. Definitely don't believe that at all. I do think a lot of I have a huge number of examples where that American model and that American ideology is being exported globally. And you particularly see this if you're looking at the anti-colonialist rhetoric used by the right, in places like Africa and Latin American countries. So there's a huge amount of export there, but they all have very, very different traditions. And this is very clear when, for example, you compare what is happening in Poland or Hungary to what's happening in America. And there are very big differences in the narrative that is dominating those discourses, equally depressing and equally anti-democratic and populist, but they are very, very different from the American rhetoric. And the British case as well. If you look at I was talking, and I've written a lot, which you can find, I've got separate articles on this on my website. If you look at the very different discourses about the anti-trans, and those coalitions that I talked about there in my paper, the American coalitions that I talked about in my paper. Okay, there are two things I can say. Firstly, that British small group, and it's a very small group, I have to say, but very powerful and media savvy, in Britain are making these coalitions with American groups. And here I'm thinking about the LGBT Alliance, for example, in Britain. I'm thinking about the Women's Liberation Front, WOLF, who have made and are continuing to make these alliances. That said, there's a separate British tradition here, which is less embedded in the broader scheme of policy that has much deeper roots in the American context than it has in the British context, which is very much 21st century Gender Recognition Act response to, et cetera. So yes, I think there's a very different story to be told if you're looking globally, but we have to keep those two things in mind. Yes, there are huge American influence and export of these ideas, particularly if you look at the critique on the UN and groups like that and WHO. But no, there are also separate nation-based traditions and ideological formations that are made.
I'm going to do a terrible thing. She may never speak to me again. But I see Jude Kelly in the audience. And Jude founded the Women of the World Festival and Women's World Movement. And I know you've spoken about the way sharing stories across cultures and positive stories can help. And I wonder if could we have a microphone for Jude, if he had anything to say on this. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, well, first of all, thank you. I mean, it's always amazing to hear Joanna's analysis, which is usually much braver than many others, and also more depressing, but also, therefore, more galvanizing, And I say that because I think that we, and I'll say, you know, the generalised group of people who've been optimistic about gender equality advancement have been very happy, almost joyful, in the last, I would say, 18 years maybe, but 15 years since WOW began anyway, which was before Malala, before Me Too, before many of the things that have taken us even further down that road of sort of energy. There has been this sense of an upward mobility. Same-sex marriage was embraced inside that, lots of things. And I think that we have been naively alarmed and kind of, oh my goodness, what's happening? Because we've been unwittingly going in forward with these high hopes, not knowing that there was a much, much more strategic journey happening between all of the alliances that you're referring to, with far, far deeper, long-standing, sort of almost, biblical, theological certainties. And the one thing that I think that as the feminist movement has always had to acknowledge is that unless you change theology, every theology really, that finally says, you know, patriarchy is the divine right of the world, then actually your rights are always conditional. So I think that what you're really saying is these conditionalities that we understand are always under threat, but they are so much more under threat than we've known. And I think that in lots of circumstances, by us sort of trivializing a group of people that we didn't agree with, we just totally underestimated the power. But therefore, we have to be optimistic, like you say, and get on and carry on creating solidarity, but perhaps with a little bit more savviness.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jude. I loved seeing you there in the audience. Thank you. Okay, a number of responses to that. Firstly, the point you made about trivializing people who are different from us. I'm constantly amazed by the fellow academics and others who have actually never spoken, had a serious discussion with someone from a, for example, particularly evangelical nationalist. And it constantly surprises me that even in the analysis of voting, the analysis of what's happening, really until Iran, there was actually very little serious academic research done on these groups because we don't talk to them and we don't listen to them and take their views seriously. And these are, you know, and this is why I was making that point about these are deep, really sensual, community building ideologies, theological ideologies. Second point I want to make is that, of course, theology changes. You know, the dispensationalists I was talking about, that's modern. That's late 1860s? No, later than that, 1880s. It's late 19th century. So we see through history that things change. Theology changes, and they all, you know, and there's this assertion that this is the truth of all times, but of course these are all very modern theological things. And the final response to this is about, is again an historical point, you know, the triumphalism of some leftist feminists. You know, we didn't quite see it coming. I didn't see it coming. Maybe you did, Jude, because you're better at this than I am. But I certainly didn't see it coming. But of course, this has happened so many times in the past with feminist movements and other liberationist movements. Then we can actually look at how they dealt with these threats to what they thought were self-contained truth, that women are equal to men, how they dealt with them in the past as well. And this is why I think, you know, history is really a useful way of thinking about strategies. You know, you look at history, but then you've got to let it go, and you've got to create the future. And that is what all the important political and theological leaders and feminist leaders of the past have done.
I have one more question. I've got one more hand here. Anyone who's studying theology can, of course, sign up for our wonderful colleague Jen Strawbridge's course on why the environment, women and Black Lives Matter in the New Testament. But there we are. Catherine.
Thank you, Joanna. You quoted Octavia Butler quoting Ecclesiastes saying, there is nothing new under the sun. And then you quoted her going on to say, but there are new suns. My question is, what for Octavia are the new suns, and indeed, what are they for you?
Octavia died very young, unfortunately. She slipped and hit her head. There was actually meant to be a third volume. This is the one I spoke about was the second volume. Octavia Butler had a very, very strong sense of the need to create an egalitarian society and real despair of the society that she was writing in the 1990s. She, I mean, deep, almost depressive despair at times. But she surrounded herself with strong communities of women, of minoritized people, and she believed in that grassroots, the ability of us, and at that level, the local level, to make change. In terms of my other sons, in my Disgrace book, the final chapter of the Disgrace book asks what is still most important question to me, and that is, how can we create a world without violence? And I proposed a number of different things in that book, 4 main tenets, which were localism, in other words, local concerns, grassroots. Second, diversity, which I mean diversity in terms of personnel, but also diversity in terms of strategy. The third was pleasure, that we need pleasure, else we just we die inside. Which is why I do think emphasizing the positives is so important. But in pleasure, I mean things like music, art, poetry, finding ways to create within these movements. And the fourth is the body, that for all the absolutely fantastic changes that online communications have made, recalcitrant bodies create recalcitrant politics. So people getting together and making a change. And I guess the umbrella term over those 4 themes were intersectionality, but also transversalism. But I changed in this paper because transversalism today is also meaning coalitions. Sorry, transversalism means coalitions between groups who disagree, so a shift from identity politics to a purpose, to achieving an aim politics. But of course, that can also occur on the right, as well as on the center and left. So the care being taken there. So it doesn't quite answer your question, but it's the best I can give.
So before I ask you to join me in thanking Joanna for that wonderful lecture, I'm going to just tell you what's coming up next in the Mansfield Public Events. If you are free tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, we have a free concert in our Music at Mansfield series. We hold a free concert every term. This one is George Blakesley, who's a fellow of the Sinfonia Smith Square, with a concert of music for the English clarinet with James Brown, our Director of Music here at Mansfield. And then next Friday at 5:30, we have a talk which may be of interest to people in this room. Professor Rebecca Henderson is talking, the title of her talk is Reweaving Ourselves, Exploring the Integration of Love and Power. And she's going to be talking about what kind of world, what kind of democracy we might build if we didn't start by assuming people were selfish, but also imagine them as cooperative and kind. So many of the things that you've been talking about.
Lovely.
But now please join me in thanking Joanna for giving this year's very wonderful and very moving Jonathan Cook Memorial Lecture.